I'm Christopher. I think the word founder is like a little bit suboptimal, actually. Like, how do you found a blockchain? I don't know. Like, people start running the blockchain, they run the blockchain. It's not a company. But we'll stick with it for now. Maybe contributor is a better one to go to. But I work on Anoma and Namada, and today I'm going to try and situate a little bit how we kind of understand these protocols as relating to the, really the broader ecosystem of autonomous ecologies represented at this event. And the reason that I'm doing that, also the alternative titles for this talk, is to kind of situate in a way that doesn't involve quite so much protocol speak. What are these crazy people doing? Why are there so many names? They have spent 2 years researching something and no one knows what it is. Will they ever ship? Maybe you've been asking these questions, just didn't tell me because you wanted to be polite. You should come ask me, say them directly. But even if not, instead I'm going to describe Namada and Anoma in a different way. Which I think might illuminate kind of at least how we understand the relations, and I want to perhaps test if our understanding makes sense to you or not. And that is to say that Namada and Anoma are protocols for autonomous ecologies. So perhaps I should actually first answer the question of what are autonomous ecologies? And it's very dangerous to define terms. It's like whenever you define a term, you sort of attach this fixed structure to a nebulous concept, and the nebulous concept has a certain coordinating power when it's slightly less defined because people can populate it with many diverse ideas. But I think it also helps to kind of understand the contours of the space in which we're navigating, particularly as different groups and different organizations building different protocols and social structures and memes, which we hope to kind of interoperate and work with each other and coordinate. So I'm just offering our definition of this term as we kind of understand it and understand our relation to it. So to us, autonomous ecologies are groups or maybe organisms that want to define their own boundaries, self-govern their internal operations, and interoperate with others. And you might say, wait, sounds like organizations. What's new? So at the risk of being, conceptually reductive, oh no, this is so much better with the images. Okay, well, I am going to illuminate this via a dichotomy. So let's say, for contrast, for the purposes of contrast, that we live in the world of Westphalian Ecologies. And the image which should be here is like a bunch of European aristocrats sitting around a table with like a fancy, a French painting on the wall, debating, what to order their constituents to do. Right, so Westphalian ecologies, I think, can be characterized by a rigid and standardized set of articulable and enforceable relationship types. Concretely, for example, here are some relationship types that Westphalian ecologies frequently employ. Employer, employee, employed, unemployed, for-profit, non-profit, stuff like this. Now, why? I think it's often easy to kind of resort to a sort of theoretical position where you see something you don't like in the world, and you resort to kind of the assumption that someone consciously caused it, like someone intended you some bad thing, and they caused this. And I think often this, the particular case that I see this, that I want to illuminate because I think it's relevant to this audience and this space, is sometimes in the like privacy space or the cypherpunk space, the anarchist space, it's easy to kind of attribute a kind of agency to the actors or to the state itself that is, let's just say, evil. Like things are explained by resort to the explanation that someone intended to cause harm. And I think occasionally that's true. But I think that it doesn't really explain sort of structural systemic patterns that recur across many different societies, many different cultures around the world. And in particular, it doesn't explain a lot about how to create a different equilibrium. So when I look at these kinds of standardized relationship types that Westphalian ecologies employ, to me, they seem like they're really not the result of any kind of conscious, bureaucratic ill intent. Rather, they're the result of optimization for legibility to the state. And the reason that these kinds of relationships must be legible to the state is that the state guarantees to enforce them. The state guarantees to enforce employer law, laws that govern employers, employees, for-profit, non-profit corporations, laws that govern unemployed and employed people, right? The state guarantees to enforce these kinds of commitments that people make to each other, that companies make to their employees or employees to employers. And I mean, most of us probably want, insofar as we live under the aegis of a state which enforces things, we want that state to be fair. And fair enforcement requires legibility and standardization, right? So in a sense, I think we can understand what's going on, is that we're asking too much of the state. I recently went to a German notary last week, actually in Berlin, and I really like this notary. She's the best notary I've ever worked with because she clearly understands the intent of the law, right? She spends time explaining what a particular sentence means, explaining the context of German law. But it also made me realize that when we write contracts and when we kind of encode the relationships which we have with one another into this framework, what we're really doing is we're asking the state to enforce the commitments that we're making to each other, right? Like I can just say, Helix, for example, has a bunch of employees, and I could just go to them and I could say, I'm going to pay you next month. And quite reasonably, they would probably look at me a bit quizzically, right? And the tax bureau would look at them and me very quizzically, right? We agreed in the social equilibrium to use this kind of, we want commitments that are enforced, so that some of these parties who are entering into relationships with each other, like employers and employees, don't need to fully trust each other. There's kind of some overlying commitment enforcement system. But I think that we're just, we're going to be limited. When we ask the state to enforce our commitments, we are limited to the things that the state knows how to enforce. So if we want a kind of different system of self-governance, we really need to be able to account for and enforce these commitments internally. And this, to me, is a kind of, again, a little bit reductive, but a key distinction between Westphalian ecologies and autonomous ecologies is that autonomous ecologies will not rely on the state. They will rely on protocols, both kind of the technical protocols at the sort of deep level and the kind of social protocols surrounding them and governing their use to enforce their commitments themselves. So interestingly, you observe this sort of convergence of language where we use the word state to refer to two things which seem like they're very different, to refer to the unified sort of governing body philosophy set of people involved in a Westphalian nation-state style systems of law and enforcement, and to refer to the piece of data that says whether or not you own a CryptoKitty on the Ethereum blockchain. So these sorts of state may seem like they're kind of unrelated and different, but I think this perspective actually illuminates in a way in which they are sort of similar. In particular, though, the difference here is that the kinds of commitments that we can enforce by protocols, both social, kind of technical, and sociocultural, if we can do them through self-governance, don't need to be legible to the state. And I think I hope that in autonomous ecologies, this can facilitate a kind of Cambrian explosion of relational ontology. So that as opposed to, everyone is sort of forced into the straitjacket of specific types of relationships. And most of these relationships, employer-employee, unemployed-unemployed, are, they're oriented around simple dichotomies that are easy to define, easy to standardize and enforce. With a large bureaucracy, they were designed for, large industrial production systems. Is this the current problem that we should be optimizing our society around? Perhaps not. And I hope that autonomous ecologies will kind of let's say instantiate a reflourishing of different kinds of relations, so that instead of being excessively standardized, organizations will be excessively diverse. There will be many tokens, many metrics, many types of relationships, subtlety, nuance, context, specificity. Probably not all of these experiments will work, right? I mean, it's not only state law that causes this specific set of relationships to be so common. It's also just how people are used to working together, what kinds of relationships produce sustainable organizations. But my hope is that with kind of the constraint of state legibility removed, we will see a lot of experimentation. And from that experimentation, we can perhaps kind of understand some new, different, sort of sustainable and interesting patterns. And I think you can see some examples of this. These examples they're not yet necessarily encoded into sort of technical protocols, but I think they're encoded into language. For example, at this event, there are 4 different organizations, there are many organizations represented, but 4 of them describe themselves in these ways, as I kind of collated a little bit, and probably many I don't know about: Post-Web Society, Coordination Collective, Vibe Care Collective, and Public Goods Laboratory. Now, what are these? Like, these are just some words, right? But they seem to describe, to me, they describe a pattern of relationships or a pattern of coordination that, perhaps the people involved in these organizations have designed together. And they're intended to describe, the orienting goal and really the orienting organizing principles, right? And those, those kinds of relationships are going to involve different relationships within the organizations, right? These are descriptions of what the organizations are, right? Kind of to the rest of the world, but also to their members. And I expect that we'll see also a kind of flourishing of relational ontologies within organizations. So now, to situate Namada and Anoma, I want to talk a little bit about where autonomous ecologies live. And at the moment, autonomous ecologies, I think they exist. I think you can see kind of aspects of this in many DAOs. But they live on the surveillance state of Ethereum. And this is not a criticism of the Ethereum community or blockchain, just sort of a statement of fact. The state of Ethereum is subject to surveillance, right? And that's kind of the territory in which these autonomous ecologies are currently operating. Now, our hope with Anoma is to provide a kind of arboreal taiga forest to which some of these autonomous ecologies can eventually move. And in order to provide what we think those autonomous ecologies will need at the kind of protocol layer, will need in order to define, account for, enforce their own commitments, define their own boundaries, define their relationships with other ecologies and with the world, as well. It's quite a lot. The protocols must sort of be value neutral, but value explicit, must allow communities to define and enforce different values, to account for the commitments they make to each other, to program exactly what they think those commitments should mean, and to control their own information, both within and with other organizations. And this, the image here was a picture of Helix Engineers working hard at their laptops, but this does take a long time. So I think it's also helpful to discuss kind of in between the surveillance state of Ethereum and the arboreal taiga, where might we be soon, and what does it look like? And this I call the Twilight Zone. So Namada is our offering to kind of help bridge between these worlds, protocol-wise, community-wise, and should say at the bottom, philosophy-wise. And Namada, so I want to now speak to kind of, now that I've defined autonomous ecologies, perhaps speculatively, but I want to speak to those autonomous ecologies and explain a little bit about what we understand Namada and Anoma is providing to you. So Namada, to your autonomous ecology, aims to provide three things: private payments for previously public assets, shielded actions for public application interoperability, and public goods funding for the private stack. And you'll notice that in each of these sentences, you see the words private and public. And that's not random. This is kind of representative of how we're bridging between these worlds, right? We want to support privacy kind of where it counts, but allow for interoperation with the current sort of public world. So private payments, Namada will be one hop from Cosmos, one hop from Ethereum, just sitting tight, providing privacy to other users. You'll generate some shielded rewards, and the more kind of users share a privacy set, the more privacy everyone has, win-win. Shielded actions will allow you to keep your assets shielded at rest, as Awa described in her earlier presentation. Initiate an action on Namada, which will unshield just what you need, send it elsewhere to Ethereum or Cosmos to use some public application, perhaps a swap, perhaps a DAO vote, perhaps a lending protocol, something else, and the results can be routed back and shielded again on Namada. And if you add something like a threshold signature scheme like Frost, you can get a pretty simple, simple DAO. Finally, Namada aims to offer public goods funding for the private stack. So we think that something like public goods funding is as important as the use of protocol token inflation as a kind of consideration for the community as proof of stake security. Namada has a public goods funding system based on stewards who can nominate things for a kind of optimized fast path to payments or grants. And I would emphasize that public goods funding is not altruism. If we want a world of flourishing autonomous ecologies, I think we need collective funding for collective goods, and Namada aims to offer, at least a kind of option as a Schelling point for that. We really can't do it alone. So if we look at kind of what safety for autonomous ecologies looks like in this twilight zone in between worlds, it still requires some patchwork protocol quilting. So if we look at what the Patchwork protocol quilt looks like, if you wanted to kind of operate an autonomous ecology in this twilight zone, maybe this is like the set of tools you use, right? Signal for comms, Namada for assets at rest, Penumbra for private swaps, NIM for the network layer, Skift, CryptPad for the docs, et cetera, it's hacky. These are a bunch of different protocols. They weren't really built to work together. Some of them kind of were, but not entirely. But there's a lot of progress here, right? And the ability to interoperate with the public world. So I want to say just a little bit about kind of what Anoma is working on and why we think it might be relevant for autonomous ecologies. Anoma aims to kind of unify this patchwork quilt of protocols in a certain sense, to provide a kind of unified base operating system that generalizes in the appropriate ways and doesn't make decisions that we shouldn't be making. As we understand our role as protocol designers, it's really to kind of not make decisions. It's to figure out the sort of general primitives and general structure of relations which these kinds of distributed coordination protocols need, and to parameterize out all of the choices about trust, all of the choices about privacy, information disclosure, so that those can be made at runtime by the users, by you. And this involves unifying a bunch of things. So for example, we really spend a lot of effort to get the same identity system throughout the whole stack, so that if you pay to an address, that's an address you could also like send a message to, that these concepts of identity are unified, that the peer-to-peer layer, if you want to disclose this information, can understand how to route to any kind of identity used at any layer of the system. And we're working on programmable information flow control, which will enable stuff that we don't currently think of as being like necessarily important for privacy, and I think it's absolutely correct that it's not the most important next step for privacy in this Twilight Zone, but I think it will be important eventually. Private consensus, for example, you don't necessarily, if we are in a seriously adversarial scenario, what an adversary will try to disrupt is your ability to come to consensus, right? And we see this in like union busting, for example, stuff like this. Like the state or whoever the adversary might be is going to try and tamper with the system that allows who they now designate as their adversary to come to agreement on how to act. Anoma tries to make commitments and assumptions explicit so that they can be tracked in the system. And automated counting, and in particular, we're building something we call fractal instances. And I want to explain a little bit about what those are. So our, quote-unquote endgame, or really the beginning of a new game, but endgame for us as protocol developers, is to offer what we call fractal instances for and to autonomous ecologies. So fractal instances are not like, they're not like build your own blockchain. That I think is maybe the most direct association most people have, and we draw a lot of inspiration from those protocol traditions, but they're a different thing. I think a better way to think about fractal instances is consensi created on demand. So currently the kind of typical user interaction with the blockchain is sort of inverted, that you first choose an application which is going to be hosted by some consensus provider, and then you decide what to do, right? So you make the choice of consensus first and action second. And fractal instances invert this. You make the choice of action first, and according to the action which you're taking, you decide which consensus you need to use. So if you're sending some kind of payment within your organization, you only need organizational consensus. If you're sending some kind of payment across a federated group of organizations, then you need their consensus. If you're sending some kind of global payment to someone else all the way across the world you don't trust, then maybe then you need global consensus, right? But we want to derive what consensus you need from what you're trying to do. Fractal instances are designed to allow application data and logic to kind of move freely across trust boundaries. So I think a good example of a permissioning system that kind of has the level of complexity that we want to be able to represent here is a Discord chat. So Discord chats have, it's of course centralized, but Discord chats have complex multi-layer permissions that are designed for communities with complex multi-layer relationships, right? Discord communities are not typically all employed by the same, employer or something like this. Still, the system of control is hierarchical, but there is a level of kind of parameterization of these relationships that we think is important to be able to represent and describe in decentralized systems. This entails, for example, that the Anoma wallet kind of just runs an Anoma node. Although there is a role distinction in the network, the roles are dynamic. So instead of having different specific protocols which handle different specific roles, like validator or solver or wallet or something, we have kind of a protocol that's universal, but that can be configured to perform different roles at runtime. So yeah, maybe some analogies about fractal instances: less blockchain, more fancy spreadsheet, built into the relational structure of usage. They're technically also roll-ups. It depends on how you define the word roll-up. Everything is a roll-up. Right, okay. In the last 50 seconds here, I just want to note a few upcoming things that might be of interest. First, we'll be starting Namada key collection, hopefully in the next few weeks, next month maybe, once the Ledger app goes through final conformance testing. And finally, we will have an announcement about Anoma this week on Thursday. So check out Adrian Brink's talk at ECC for that. Finally, the thing I want to impress upon you is that we are interested in working for you, autonomous ecologies. So please come tell us what you want, and we want to check our assumptions, check if our understanding of the space is correct, check if our understanding of how to think about what we should be providing is correct. We'd love to chat. Thank you.